Is free trade the enemy of America? Donald Trump seems to think so. He says his tough, broad-brush tariffs will make America wealthy again. But to achieve that, he seems willing to contradict the vast majority of economists, bully his neighbours, threaten existing trading partners and risk a global trade war. So, are Trump's tariffs worth the cost? It's up for debate on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. Tariffs. Donald Trump says it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. Our country and its taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years, but it is not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen.
He believes this economic weapon will fire up American manufacturing and fill government coffers with cash. The leading voice in US tax policy estimates it could generate an additional $100 billion in tax revenue. But at what cost? According to multiple top economists, it will cause higher inflation, higher consumer prices, and a higher risk of recession. The geopolitical ramifications, though, are harder to quantify.
The old relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperations, is over. It's my solemn promise that when President Trump threatens us again, we will fight back.
A global trade war is brewing. You know you're in turbulent times when communist China supports open markets more than capitalist America, who's pushing for protectionism. Old rivals are even looking to work together against the US. South Korea, China, and Japan have held their first economic dialogue in 5 years. I'll ask my expert panel if tariffs can really make America wealthy again, whether Trump's economic bullying is just his latest negotiating tactic, and if the US is economically strong enough to weather a global trade war. Welcome, and to go deeper into the Liberation Day tariffs, I'm joined by Steve Hanke, a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He was also a senior economist on President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisers. And we also have with us Tomas Philipson, former member and chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers in the first Trump administration and current Daniel Levin chair in public policy at the University of Chicago. Gentlemen, welcome to Counterpoints. Donald Trump says he has inherited what he calls a sick patient. He says the US economy was in a terrible state when his administration took over the White House, and that this early negative market reaction is to be expected. But he has no doubt that manufacturing will soon boom and all Americans will prosper. So, Tomas, I'd like to start with you. Will these tariffs make America wealthy again?
I want to start with the background, which is that the U.S. is really the victim versus the criminal before this started, essentially, in international trade policy. We documented that in an annual report that came out of the Council of Economic Advisers in 2018, how much worse we're treated abroad. Our companies are treated abroad than we treat their companies at home. So obviously, that's the impetus for all this, to try to change that imbalance. And when you do have a change in that imbalance, you're necessarily going to generate uncertainty. The market is not going to fully understand where the change is going. And I don't think anyone knows where the change is going. But what the April 2nd announcement does, part of it does, the reciprocity, is basically put people now put them under pressure to start negotiating down. That's what I like about the reciprocity of the agreement. I'm not so much in favor of the floor of 20 or 10% floor that they have on the tariff, but the reciprocity basically puts pressure on these countries now to start coming down. They've been talking about we could have just come down without this, but they haven't done that for decades. So that's just sort of what economists call cheap talk. Now, this is really an opportunity for them to benefit from coming down. And that's why this leverage was essentially put up. So for me, it's all about what happens going forward here. We don't know that. The market doesn't know that. And market obviously hate uncertainty. But we will have Israel, Vietnam, India, and Switzerland have already started to come down. And the question is how many other countries will follow in that path.
All right, Steve, what's your take?
Well, my take is that I don't think we've been victimized in the United States. The trade deficit results from a very fundamental identity in economics. It's a savings investment identity. And the deficits in the United States aren't caused by foreigners ripping us off and giving us a bad deal. They're homegrown. The savings in the United States are deficient relative to the investment, and that deficiency, that gap, is filled in with trade. It's just a simple identity in economics. So the idea that somehow foreigners cause this is just incorrect. It's just absolute nonsense. Deficits or surpluses, whatever the imbalances are in the international accounts, they're created domestically, not by foreigners. Why does China have a huge surplus? Because they have a surplus of savings relative to investments. Switzerland, exactly the same thing. Any country with a surplus has a surplus of savings relative to investment. Any country that is witnessing a deficit has a deficiency of savings relative to investment. Now, it turns out the deficits in the United States, Trump thinks foreigners cause them. Well, he's wrong about that. We create them ourselves. And we primarily, by the way, create them. That savings deficiency is caused by the fact that the US runs a fiscal deficit in almost every year. So as a result, since 1975, we've always had trade deficits in the United States, and they're good for the United States. They're a good deal for the Americans because we have very thick capital markets. We have the international currency. Everyone wants to be in the US dollar, in America. So it's very easy for America to finance these deficits.
Whether or not they're created by the US, whether they're created by the foreign trading partners, do you think, though, that the policies announced on Liberation Day, as it's being called by President Trump, will make Americans wealthy again? Is it going to work?
No, they're going to make America poor again. It's a doom loop day. It's probably the stupidest economic policy we've had now for almost 100 years, because you have to go back to 1930, March of 1930. That's when the Smoot-Hawley tariff was put in, something similar or akin to what's going on now. It was a little clearer, actually, than what's going on now, because as Tomas mentioned, we have uncertainty. Now, let me just make a remark about that. It isn't just plain old-fashioned uncertainty that we have with Trump. We have what's called regime uncertainty. That is, the whole regime is changing. All kinds of things are changing. It's exactly like the New Deal. Remember the propaganda around the New Deal when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came in? Happy days are here again. Well, that was just propaganda. It was a disaster because when the New Deal started, there were so many changes going on in Washington, D.C., that something called regime uncertainty reared its ugly head. And when regime uncertainty rears its ugly head, investors hunker down and don't invest. So We went from 1929 to actually the end of World War II. There was virtually no investment in the United States because people didn't know what was going on. Remember, Roosevelt made it illegal for Americans to hold gold. And he did a huge devaluation, by the way, and
Thomas,
took away
what do you think about Steve's comments there? Is this the stupidest decision since the 1930s?
Well, I agree with Steve fully. I think most economists agree with Steve that trade deficits is not a measure of something where someone is a victim versus a criminal, obviously. I have a trade deficit with my grocery store. I only buy from them. I don't sell anything to them. Presumably, that's a good relationship. So that's not the issue. The issue is the policies, and that's what we documented in 2018. No one can disagree with that. China, for example, requires, they own our companies to enter there sometimes. They rip off our IP, etc. No one can disagree with that. Europeans have higher tariff policies. Forget what the trade deficits is resulting from that, but that we are treated worse in terms of trade policies. That gets reflected, obviously, with it's not only consumption and investment, but also how easy it is to get into those markets that do determine trade deficits. And that is the issue at hand. I think the White House is a little bit too focused on the trade deficit as a measure of that, particularly on the April 2nd when they came up with the reciprocity and tariffs.
Steve says that this is going to make Americans poorer. Do you agree with that?
I think if we open up foreign markets, like I said, India, Israel, Switzerland, and others are now opening up their markets more towards the US. And if we respond by opening up our markets to them, then presumably, if you believe in free trade, that's a good thing. And if that's the result of this, this is a good thing. I'm not so sure that these floors are a good thing if they're not going to be negotiated down. I'm all for setting up leverage to generate more free trade. And that's initially what this was about. It was setting up leverage to get more free trade.
Let's look at manufacturing, because that's one of the big things that President... Go ahead, Professor.
Just one thing to follow up on what Tomas said. The idea that opening up foreign markets somehow is going to change the trade balance is not correct. As I said, the trade balance is determined by the gap between savings and investment, period. It's domestically produced. It's created domestically. That's why we have the imbalance that we have. And it happens, it's a very good thing to have in the United States because it's very easy to finance. We have no problem financing it. And it allows Americans to do what? To consume way more than they produce. It's a good deal.
Well, if we're talking about consuming more than US producers, if we look at manufacturing, 40% as an estimate from what some industry sectors are saying, 40% of US imports are what they call inputs, meaning they're the components that US manufacturers need to produce products on US soil. So if even those inputs are going to cost more, doesn't that just mean manufacturing is going to cost more? How does President Trump think all of a sudden manufacturing is going to be cheap in the US? Tomas, why don't you take us?
Language. Go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead, Tomas.
Well, I think his language is that manufacturing will be moved into the U.S. That's the way he portrays this will become cheaper, because there's a conditional tariff rate only if you produce abroad, as opposed to you have a zero tariff rate when you come here, and that's basically how the White House is selling that this will lower prices, even though I think, it's the reason it's abroad is obviously many times because it is cheaper, but it's not going to be the same pattern of imports of inputs after this agreement. So taking the current 40% or whatever the exact number is misleading, because that's not going to be the one going forward.
Steve?
Well, I think the important thing is to get back to kind of the basics a little bit. And what are tariffs? Tariffs are a tax on international transactions. So if you tax something, you're going to get less of it. And if you get less international trade, particularly given the benefits that exist from international trade, why do you think we have international trade? Because a buyer thinks they're getting a good deal by trading with some foreigner, and the foreigner thinks they're getting a good deal by selling it to somebody in America. So it's a good deal. Obviously, there are benefits. Otherwise, there wouldn't be trade. Now we have the government coming in with these wacko tariff taxes that they're putting on something that's beneficial. It benefits the seller, it benefits the buyer. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any trade. And now the government's coming and saying, no, we don't like this pattern that's developing, and we want to tax you. This is just supply side economics 101. It's the same as any other kind of tax, only it is on international transactions. Now, if we go back, by the way, and the market, what's going on in the market, it does relate to something I mentioned earlier. In March of 1930, it was announced that we were going to have the Smoot-Hawley tariff imposed in the United States. And it's something akin to what's going on now, because what was the environment in 1930? The money supply was contracting. That caused a slowdown in the start of the Great Depression. Then, on top of that, you had the announcement of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in March that went into effect in July. And what happened? The market crashed. And the market, from the time of the announcement in 1930 at March until June 1932, the low of the market, it lost 83%, the Dow did. So I think we're in for rough times. We've seen this movie before. It's clear that the people around Trump have no clue of what's going on. Trump acts like it'll be a little blip in a couple of days and so forth. If this doesn't change, we're in for a lot of trouble.
Thomas, I want to ask
and I would say diplomatically, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. The U.S. is just creating enemies.
We're going to come to the diplomatic effects.
We almost have no friends.
We're going to come to those diplomatic effects in a very short moment. But before we move on to that section of our debate, I just want to ask one final question to Thomas. You have said that part of tax revenue from tariffs is better than income taxes, that money in the federal coffers is better to come from tariffs than income taxes. What guarantee is there, though, that income taxes are going to come down across the board? What's stopping people just pocketing this money, the big corporations, and the government not passing any of it on?
I think I just want to agree with Steve first that free trade is valuable, certainly. And it's not only tariff, it's also non-tariff measures, regulations typically that favor the domestic companies over the foreign companies that are barriers to that trade. My hope is that if you have now pressure on these, so other countries have prohibited, or not prohibited, but have raised more barriers to free trade than we have, them coming into us. So if other countries followed the countries I mentioned, such as Israel and China or India and others, and are reducing that barrier to free trade in response to this, if they want to negotiate down, that's why I like the reciprocity. If that puts pressure to them to open up for more free trade, I like that. I don't like the floor so much, regardless of what you do. But if you respond by opening up free trade abroad, we will do the same now, and then eventually we can bargain this down. I mean, completely free trade is possible under full reciprocity, meaning 0-0 on both ends in that case. That would be, I think Steve and I would both agree, that would be a good outcome if that was actually the case. And I don't know where this will go. Maybe some countries will respond upwards, some countries will respond downward, like we have seen already. But that's the real question for me. Will this actually put pressure on foreign countries to open up their markets, which I and Steve, I believe, agree is a good thing?
Steve, do you want to respond to that before we move on?
I think Thomas is engaging in a little bit of wishful thinking. By the way, as a free trader, somebody like, for example, Milton Friedman always used to say he never could understand why people thought trade deficits were a bad thing. It was a complete mystery to him. Well, it is a little bit of a mystery to me too. But back to the wishful thinking part of driving all these interventions on international transactions away, zero tariffs, no non-tariff barriers, no quotas, and so forth. Yeah, that would be wonderful. I'm a free trader, so I'm always against all sanctions. Sanctions are a form, by the way, of protectionism, and they're in the same family as tariffs, as quotas, and non-tariff barriers. Sanctions are, and they're widely used by now. Virtually every politician in Washington is all gung-ho about sanctions. So it's easy for them, some of them, to slide into this tariff deal. Now, let me go to the other side of the coin from the wishful thinking, getting everything fixed. If you impose tariffs, you end up, that's a beggar thy neighbor type policy that was actually something that was coined by Joan Robinson in the late 1930s, famous Cambridge economist. And the point is that when you do impose these, there's a counterattack. Just look at what China did. Thomas is talking about this nickel and dime stuff with Israel and so forth. Big deal. It's irrelevant. What's relevant is what's going on with either the second or first biggest economy in the world, and it happens to be China. China is the elephant in the room, and they counterattack. And by the way, they have technocrats who are a hell of a lot smarter than most of the technocrats in Washington, D.C., and I think they know exactly what they're going to do. They know the chess game, and they have it all laid out. So this is going to be pretty rough going.
It's going to be brutal. We are going to talk about China.
I think China is a separate case where you have a military or geopolitical adversary that you're dealing with. So coming back to my simple example of my grocery store, I have a trade deficit with it. But if my grocery store hires a hitman to go after me with the purchases I make from them, I'm not so interested in having a trade deficit with that grocery store. I think the Chinese case is different from our geopolitical or military allies. And China is an adversary, so us funding them building up their military is an issue, which it's not the standard issue in terms of tariff policy, I think, that we're concerned with, because they are necessarily getting richer off our purchases. And then the question becomes, is that a good thing or not in the long run?
Seeing as we're talking about...
What are you suggesting, Thomas? You're actually for going to war commercially with China?
No, I just think restricting China everyone understands that China is an adversary. So there is something about building up their military with unfair trade policies that people don't like.
That's an assumption. I think you've been around Washington, D.C. too long. I don't view China.
I mean, that's not a good argument. You need to argue on the facts and logic instead of that argument, Steve.
Well, you say they're an adversary. You define them as an adversary, so you want to do things that you think hurt them. You also have to ask, how much is that going to cost the Americans?
What do you think, Thomas? I mean, when we talk about China, if we consider that in 2001, most countries in the world traded more with the US than they did with China, whereas now more than 70% of the world's economies trade more with China. So isn't there a risk, Thomas, that these moves could just strengthen China more, that the US isn't economically strong enough anymore to weather this global trade war it started?
I think, I mean, like I said, I view China or economically building up a foreign adversary as different from our allies, you know, Canada, Mexico, Europe, etc. That's a different type of trade-off for me in setting economic policy against them. I think the issue with, you know, if you go country by country here, Mexico had a lot of concessions on the border without any real tariffs taking place. And we got that through having that leverage on them, which they didn't do without that leverage. So there was zero tariffs, and Mexico reacted very strongly in trying to clean up the border. That's the ultimate, in my view, that's the ultimate value of this, is essentially using it as an unused threat. We did that with the military, obviously. We had nuclear bombs that were never used after World War II, but we had an enormous influence by having them, even though we never used them. I think that's the intent of some of this threat of not trading with our economy. If it doesn't get used, I'm all for it as a threat. When it gets used, I want it to have beneficial effects, which is that it ramps down or opens up markets abroad more for free trade.
Steve?
Well, let's do walk through the logic of this thing, Thomas. You clearly think tariffs hurt the foreign entity, foreign country, once they're imposed on the foreign country. And that's why you like tariffs against China, because you say they're an adversary. So I would just ask, why do we want to hurt our allies then? Why are we hurting our allies? Why are we basically, why are we pissing off the world? That's the bottom line. Because China, okay.
I think they're military. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead.
I think they're military allies, clearly. They're not economic allies in the following sense. They're treating us entering their markets a lot worse than we're treating them coming into our markets. That's been documented. I think everyone agrees on that. So if you're a free trader like you are, Steve, the question is, how do you rebalance that so that U.S. companies experience less trade barriers abroad, just as we had before April 2nd, we had much lower trade barriers coming in here. That's the negotiation that's been going on for, you know, decades, and no, it hasn't moved. They're still treating us worse. So what do? You just sit there and accept it, or you try to fix it, which this is an attempt doing.
Well, I think generally, if you look at the data, and forget the stupid chart that Trump had in the White House with what he claimed were the levels that tariffs would have to be to have reciprocity. That was a hokey number. Everybody realized that it was just fiction. Actually, what's happened with with tariffs and trade barriers, they've gone down throughout the last decades, and they're pretty low. They're not excessive in most places. I'm not saying they're perfect. I would prefer none, zero. But the fact is that things have been getting better, and they're very low. Tariffs amongst our allies are extremely low, and tariffs prior to, shall we say, maybe going back to Trump 1, they were pretty low in the United States too, quite low. So now this is all upsetting the apple cart. The whole thing is being changed.
We've talked about the costs, the economic costs, the numbers, but what about the unquantifiable costs? The US appears to be forcing old rivals to come back together. One only has to look at the recent meeting between Japan, China, and South Korea, holding their first economic meeting in 5 years. So two historic US allies together with Australia's top competitor. So Thomas, do you think, America's top competitor, do you think that the US should be worried about these kinds of alliances building up against them?
I think it's a concern, certainly. I'm not a foreign policy expert, so I leave that to the experts, essentially.
Economically, is it a worry if you've got these big economies ganging up, in effect, potentially against the United States?
I fully hear you. The volume is a little bad on my end. Can you repeat the question?
I just said, even if we look away from a foreign policy point of view, if we look at an economic point of view, is it a concern when you see these kinds of economic powerhouses effectively appearing to be ganging up on the US?
Well, I would think that's a concern. My hope with this is that they go the Indian route, which is India is going to be a big trading partner in the future. They have enormous trade restrictions with the US. I mean, hundreds % or more in tariffs sometimes. That's the route which, we hope this will lead to, that we now have a leverage to actually change that relationship to one where we have more open markets for our companies in those countries. You're talking about the opposite, where people are now responding upwards. We'll see what happens, but I think there's certainly many countries who are very interested in now coming to the table and negotiating down, and I view that as a very beneficial outcome if the U.S. does the same. And also, I think the key for me is this reciprocity makes a lot of sense. What doesn't necessarily make sense for me are these floors, regardless, even if they do what they do, which is what Israel do. I agree with Steve, that's a small market in the world, but they basically come down fully and are still tariffed with 10%. I think that's the mismatch, I think, for me in the reciprocity argument, which I do believe in could potentially put downward pressure on many countries.
Steve, I want to ask you, as we mentioned at the top of our debate, you were a senior economist on President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. I wonder how you think Ronald Reagan would feel if he was here seeing these developments, where you have communist China appearing to be more of a public cheerleader of free trade than capitalist the United States.
Well, I think number one, Reagan was like me. He was a free trader in principle. Trump is not. He's a mercantilist, period. And the reason Trump is a mercantilist and quite different than free trader Ronald Reagan, let me get into that. He's like many businessmen. Many businessmen like surpluses. They like a profit. They think deficits are bad, because if you have deficits year after year, you're probably going to end up going bankrupt. So what businessmen do, there's something called the fallacy of composition. They think the economy runs like their business, so that if you have an international imbalance and a trade deficit, they think that's bad. They think it's like a deficit in a business. This is just utter nonsense. And this is the way Trump and many of the people who are surrounding him and giving him advice, that's how they think, like a businessman. So they make a big mistake in that area. Now let's go to Reagan. It turns out that Reagan had a very good record in economics in terms of free markets, deregulation, stable money, and all of that. But when it comes to trade, he was a free trader. But the picture was a very mixed one that we had. His record was mixed. And the thing that was going on then in the 1980s, it wasn't China, it was Japan. Remember, Japan was the enemy in terms of the international trade thing. And there were a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill, as well as his Secretary of Commerce, Malcolm Aldridge, who are putting tremendous pressure on Reagan to intervene with various protectionist things. Remember the voluntary quotas we put on Japan for automobiles. It turned out, by the way, that kind of backfired because the Japanese were smart enough. They said, oh, okay, well, we'll limit the number of cars going into the United States. And what they started doing, instead of selling us cheap Hondas, they were selling us high-end Toyotas and Lexus and other expensive cars that had higher margins, and they actually made out like bandits with the voluntary restraints that they agreed to enter into. So this gets into the reality of things. So Reagan's a free trader. He's against all of this, but the political reality, he wasn't signing executive orders on these things. The political reality was that he was getting a lot of heat and did a lot of things that he didn't want to do, but he really politically almost had no choice. But he was a different breed of cat than Trump. He had nothing to do with Trump whatsoever. Completely different ideas. What Trump wants, it gets back to what Thomas was saying. Thomas always prefaces whatever he says. He says, I hope this will happen. He always said, I hope that they will come to the negotiating table of foreigners and reduce their tariffs. Well, that's another aspect of Trump's personality. He's a little like Louis XIV. He's the king, and everyone has to come and kneel before the king, no matter if you're the head of state or whatever. That he loves this kind of stuff. He does indeed, and also loves a chart, as we've seen. Okay, we're coming to the last segment in our debate, so I want to keep us moving on.
I would add to Steve's comparison with Reagan and Trump. They're very much aligned on tax policy and deregulation. In fact, we documented again in the economic report of the president that Trump were even more deregulatory than Reagan in terms of lifting regulations and abandoning old ones, essentially. And also the tax cuts were they're very much aligned. I think on foreign trade, trade policy, they're not the same breed, I agree. But on tax policy and deregulation, which is much more important for our economy because our domestic economy is, we trade a lot more within our country with ourselves than other countries do. We have lower import and export quotas ratios than other countries do. So the tax cuts and deregulations are much more important for reducing prices than tariffs are for raising them.
Right. I don't want to get bogged down too much in the history. Let's look to the future. So I'm going to move us on. In the weeks leading up to Liberation Day, there was a lot of uncertainty about how the tariffs would be implemented, how far Trump would go. And he has ended up targeting both friend and foe, but accusing friends sometimes of being worse than the US's enemies. So, Thomas, I'll ask you first about trust. Is the US still a reliable and trusted trading partner?
What he meant by that is you have to differentiate geopolitical enemies and adversaries, or military enemies, or allies or adversaries, versus economic allies and adversaries. And sometimes our military or geopolitical allies are treating us very, very poorly in terms of opening up their markets for our companies. I mean,
But that aside, do you think friend or foe, whether they are foreign or economic or geopolitical allies or enemies, do you think globally the US is viewed as a trusted and stable trading partner?
Well, I come back to this, that US is the victim, not the criminal before this started. So they're trying to change that in terms of opening up markets for other countries. We're trying to change that, and the international press and the US press want to paint us as being the bully when we are responding to being unfavorably treated. I think that's not necessarily an accurate representation of what this is all about.
Steve?
Well, I think Thomas is framing the thing as Trump is framing it. We have all these foreign criminals, that are ripping us off. And this gets back to the fundamental thing that I'm certain Thomas would agree with, because it's basic economics. You even teach us at the University of Chicago, or at least you used to in the old days when Chicago was Chicago, which it isn't anymore. But at any rate, the bottom line is trade imbalances are created locally. They are due to the savings investment identity. End of story. Forget the foreign criminals and we're being treated badly and all this other stuff.
I'm not saying we measure this with trade deficit, Steve. I'm not saying we measure it. I'm not saying trade deficit is the measure of what's going on. You put that in my mouth. That's not my argument. My argument is that we're treating differently in policy.
That's Trump's argument. That's Trump's argument. I'm not putting anything in your mouth. I'm just telling you that Trump views trade deficits as something that's bad, and they are created by who? By foreigners. No, trade deficits in the United States have been good. They're easy to finance, and they're created by Americans because we have a savings deficiency. I went through this very carefully. The only careful study that's ever been done in a 2019 article in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance. You can check it out, Thomas. Ed Lee and I worked, we have all the numbers and everything in there. And as it turns out, by the way, if you disaggregate the savings and investment pattern, the private sector in the United States actually generates a surplus. So you'd say, oh, well, that's savings greater than investment. That's a private sector. The public sector swamps it by having state and local governments plus the federal government. They have a savings deficiency, savings less than investment. If you add them both together, the aggregate is a deficiency in savings. And that deficiency is, as we would expect, given an identity in economics, it's exactly filled in by the trade deficit.
If we move on from trade deficit, Steve, I want to ask you, if we look at many of the countries on President Trump's list, showed that they had much higher tariffs than the US was imposing. So is there any way you can see some sense, some justification in what the president has done in order to get those countries to lower their tariffs?
No, because you indicated what you were reading off that board that Trump had. That board was utter rubbish. Any economist, even a freshman taking economics 101, could rip that thing into shreds. It's a joke. It's an embarrassing joke that he put up, and anyone should be ashamed of being associated with that kind of rubbish.
Thomas, I want to ask you then, when we talk about those charts, you've been talking a lot about reciprocity in your responses, but economists on both sides, for and against, have been, in their analysis, very confused and baffled by the White House's equation for reciprocity. Do you think they've got the maths wrong?
They're using a trade deficit, which I think is misleading. I agree with Steve there, of course, but by country, particularly misleading by country. But I think that the evidence is not the trade deficit. The evidence is in the actual policies, tariff and non-tariff policies, that we are treated worse than other countries treat us. That has nothing to do with trade deficit. That has to do with how open are their markets to our companies versus our country is open to their. There's direct measures which have been documented on tariff and non-tariff policy that there is a large imbalance. And that's what, in my view, the reciprocity is good for opening up markets worldwide for our companies. That's a free trade effect of if this gets negotiated down by other countries. I think the measuring it by trade deficits is misleading. I don't know what the alternative would be to kind of quantify it according to policies that they have. but that would have been an alternative way of doing it.
Even some people who support reciprocity and reciprocal tariffs have said that this is an ill-advised way to go about it. Thomas, what do you think about that?
I don't know what the alternative is. We have done nothing. This is one method of going after it. You can't just go over and have diplomacy. That has failed for decades. For Germany to lower they have 4 times the tariff on our cars that we have on their cars before this started, essentially. So, you know, you need something to change it. This is one way of doing it. We'll see what happens if the future has downward negotiations or upward negotiations. But clearly what we've tried in the past has not worked, and clearly doing nothing would not work.
We are almost out of time. We've got maybe 2 minutes left, and I want to get a response from both of you. So if we can keep it short. Steve, I'm going to go to you first. A prediction. Where do you think the US economy will be in 6 months' time?
It'll be in the tank. And it'll be in the tank for 2 reasons. One has nothing to do with Trump whatsoever, and that is monetary policy in the United States has been ultra tight. And since the summer of 2022, the stock of money is actually lower now than it was back in the summer of 2022. So once you have a contraction in the money supply, you eventually, with a lag, will end up with a slowing economy. We've only had a contraction in the money supply 4 times since the Fed was founded in 1913. Every one ended up in a recession. So that's kind of baked in the cake, even before Trump comes in. And that was like the Great Depression, by the way, same thing. Now Trump comes in with probably one of the worst, I think the worst economic policy with these tariffs that we've had in 100 years. And that's going to be put on top of what naturally will be a slowing economy. So that's why I say we're going to be in the tank. And by the way, the stock market will be in the tank because we have a tax being put on international transactions. And that means that after-tax profits will be less than they were before. And if after-tax profits are less,
right,
stock prices go down.
All right.
Prices go down.
Thomas, what do you think? In about one minute, if you can wrap it up, in 6 months' time, what's your forecast for the economy?
Well, it depends a little bit what happens with Congress as well. I think the tax cuts that are on the table now are going to be very, very beneficial for us. I think the deregulation that they're doing is going to be very, very beneficial for the U.S., particularly in the energy sector. I think those are more important forces for the U.S. economy than 15% of imports being affected potentially by tariffs. I think I'm more optimistic on downward negotiation, obviously, of opening up markets abroad than Steve is. But if that occurs in conjunction, those are positive forces. I do agree with the money supply argument, but I think overall economic policy of the administration gets missed because of all the tariff focus. There's a huge tax cut, or not tax cut, but tax relief of not raising the taxes from the previous tax cuts, but also additional tax cuts coming in, and also an enormous deregulatory effort. I also think that DOGE is doing the right thing and trying to reduce spending. That ultimately has to do with entitlements, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, essentially. But they're going in the right direction. We'll see what happens to those kind of issues before I take a stance of it's going to be good or bad going forward.
This has been a very interesting discussion. Gentlemen, I'm sorry okay, Steve, wrap it up fast for us.
The thing that Thomas was talking about, the tax bill that's going through, actually it isn't a tax cut. It by passing the tax bill, we will avoid a tax increase. And if that tax bill doesn't pass, we'll have a tax increase. Well, that'll even put us further in the tank if it doesn't pass. So I'm all for this thing passing, because a tax increase is the last thing we need. The tariff tax is bad enough.
Gentlemen, we could continue to debate this for another hour, but unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Your analysis, your expertise is so appreciated here on Counterpoints. Steve Hanke, a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University, and Tomas Philipson, the Daniel Levin Chair of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to you at home for joining us here on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. Remember to subscribe to Al Arabiya English's YouTube channel and follow us on X and TikTok so you don't miss out on any more of these lively discussions. Thanks for watching.